He then turned and began the quick task of putting the tomes Twilight had just retrieved back in their places. While he did that, Twilight headed to the second floor of the library. She crossed her bedroom and entered the bathroom. It was small and cozy with a bathtub that doubled as a shower and all the basic amenities. Nothing fancy, but it got the job done. Twilight shut and locked the door before breathing a sigh of relief and looking over her shoulder. Still lying on her back, nestled between her saddlebags, was the filly Nightmare Moon. She had curled up and fallen asleep halfway to the library. Thankfully, Spike hadn't noticed the breathing black mass that was partially hidden by Twilight's mane and saddlebags. For the moment, Twilight just let the filly sleep while she turned on the bathtub faucets. The tub began to fill, and as it did, Twilight opened the medicine cabinet to gather some first aid supplies. While most of the injuries the filly had from the thorny bush were tiny, there were a couple that Twilight wanted to bandage. Twilight waited until the tub was almost full before shutting off the faucets. The perfectly warm water gently steamed in the cool bathroom air, and a shiver of relief crawled down her body just from sinking her hoof into the water. Still, Twilight couldn't go jumping in until the filly was off her back and she had taken off her saddlebags. Looking back at the filly, Twilight bent her head close and gave her a nudge. It took a few tries, but the little pony finally began to wake up. She lifted her head off of Twilight's back and took in her surroundings before looking at Twilight, who offered a gentle smile.
Don't worry. You're safe here. This is where I live, and you won't have to worry about the storm or anything else here. Still, I need to get cleaned up. Would you mind getting off my back while I take a quick bath?
The filly shook her head once before very carefully and cautiously getting to her hooves and jumping off of Twilight's back. Her little wings slowed her descent to the floor, allowing her to land gently. She, however, didn't stay on her hooves for long. She laid down and curled up into a small ball on the soft bathroom mat below the sink. With the filly off her back, Twilight was able to remove her mud-splattered saddlebags and climb into the bathtub. She winced a little as hot water came into contact with colder parts of her body, but she eventually sank in with a relieved sigh. After tromping around in the storm, Twilight wanted nothing more than to soak in the warm water. She, however, needed to make it a quick bath. She picked up a brush and worked to remove the mud, twigs, and leaves that clung to her. Once they were all gone, she climbed out of the tub and let the now dirty water drain away as she toweled herself off. Then, once the tub was drained, Twilight opened the faucets and began to fill the tub again, this time only a quarter of the way full. It was a very shallow bath, but it was perfect for the small filly. Twilight levitated the miniature Nightmare Moon look-alike into the water. She winced a few times as the water came into contact with her cuts and scratches, but otherwise the filly didn't protest. She just stood there, being as complacent as possible as Twilight carefully used a brush to clean her. Once the filly was clean, Twilight lifted her out of the tub, toweled her off, and began using the first aid kit to bandage the worst of her cuts and scrapes. All the while, she was amazed with how cooperative the filly was, despite acting sad and tired. Would Nightmare Moon really allow herself to be bathed and bandaged without protest? Yes, such a regal and royal pony might expect to be waited on by servants, but that wasn't what Twilight was doing. She was treating her like a foal, and the real Nightmare Moon wouldn't accept being treated like a foal, no matter how small or young she actually was. Again, the question of whether this filly really was Nightmare Moon rose up in Twilight's head. She was becoming less and less sure. The resemblance was undeniable. If the little pony had a flowing, magical star-dotted mane and tail, then she'd look exactly like the Mare in the Moon. Yet, this filly just wasn't acting like Nightmare Moon, at least in Twilight's opinion. She didn't talk down, nor did she make threats. She hadn't even said anything yet, and the silence was even stranger. Twilight would expect Nightmare Moon to be vocal, and the filly's odd behavior only raised another question. If she wasn't Nightmare Moon, then who was she? Twilight was drawn from her thoughts by a knock at the bathroom door. She finished placing one last bandage on the filly and then turned in the direction of the door.
Yes?
Hey, Twilight, I got your dinner.
Twilight glanced over her shoulder, both to speak in Spike's direction and to make sure he wasn't coming into the bathroom.
Thank you, but, you know, I'm really hungry after hiking through the Everfree Forest in the storm. Would you mind making me another sandwich and bowl of soup?
No problem. I made a big batch of celery soup, and we have plenty of stuff for sandwiches.
That's wonderful, Spike, but I only need one more.
You got it, Twi.
Twilight waited for her assistant's footsteps to reach the bottom of the stairs before she opened the door. She checked the bedroom, making sure Spike, Owlicious, and Pee-wee were all downstairs before she stepped out. The filly followed close behind, not getting more than a few inches from Twilight as she crossed the room and moved towards the bed. The meal Spike had brought in was sitting on her bedside table. It looked good, and Twilight was starving. However, instead of digging in herself, she levitated the filly up onto her bed and set the food out in front of her.
Here, You go ahead and eat this. I'm going to go downstairs and talk with Spike.
The filly, again, didn't offer more than a simple nod in reply. She leaned forward and took a bite from the sandwich. It was a small bite, but it was quickly followed by another, and another, and another, as the filly eagerly devoured the food. It was the first real sign of life Twilight had seen from the Nightmare Moon look-alike, and it was encouraging, to say the least. For now, however, she had to leave the filly to her meal. She needed to go downstairs and tell Spike the truth before he discovered the filly for himself, assumed the worst, and sent the letter to Princess Celestia. It had taken a couple of hours to convince Spike not to write to Princess Celestia and tell her about the filly. He, like Twilight, had first assumed that she was Nightmare Moon reborn and that the princess had to be told. He had even written up a letter and was about to send it before Twilight snatched it away and threw it into the garbage. Twilight's arguments were weak. All she could really say was that the filly really didn't seem to act like Nightmare Moon. In her logical mind, Twilight knew that Spike was probably right. They needed to tell the princess, but once again, Twilight's imagination betrayed her. Princess Celestia had banished Nightmare Moon to the moon for 1,000 years. Twilight feared she would do the same to the little pony, and that just didn't feel like something the filly deserved. In the end, Twilight only got Spike to agree to silence by promising that she'd go buy him a large sapphire from Rarity as a bribe. It wasn't how she would have liked to obtain his silence, but Spike had Pinkie Pie promised that if she got him the gem in the morning, he would keep quiet about the filly until she wanted to tell Princess Celestia. Having eaten her own dinner during the negotiations, Twilight made her way back up to the bedroom. She was a little worried about what she would find. There was a chance that, in the past 2 hours, the filly had grown into an adult Nightmare Moon and was ready to attack. Yet, after she opened the bedroom door, Twilight saw that the filly was still sitting on the bed, the sandwich and soup long eaten. Taking a moment to steady herself, Twilight approached the filly, and again she found herself torn on just how she was supposed to act. Nightmare Moon had tried twice to plunge Equestria into eternal night, but the filly didn't seem like a danger. She should have consulted Princess Celestia already, but she just wasn't sure enough. It was a stalemate between her fear of what the filly could do and her fear of what the princess would do if she found out. She wasn't convinced enough to tell the princess, but she couldn't let her guard down either. If she did, there was a chance the filly would show her true colors, transform into Nightmare Moon, and attack. It was better to be safe than sorry, and Twilight chose to keep her guard up. She'd watch and be ready to bolt out of the room should things become dangerous. At the moment, however, she needed to find out more about the filly. She needed to see if she remembered being Nightmare Moon, or maybe had other memories, something to prove who she was.
Are you feeling better?
The filly nodded only once, barely meeting Twilight's eyes.
That's good. So, do you know where you are? Do you remember where you were before I found you?
The filly shook her head, the first of many such replies. Twilight asked the filly what she did remember, what she knew, and a whole slew of other questions. Yet, while there were a few nods here and there, most of Twilight's questions were met with a shake of the filly's head, and each shake seemed to cause the filly's eyes to tear up a little bit more. The breaking point came when Twilight asked the filly if she remembered her name, which caused her to break down and cry. It wasn't wailing or outright sobbing, but a quiet cry where she sniffled as tears poured down her cheeks. It was a sight that helped Twilight understand why the little pony had been so quiet and subdued. She was scared and confused. The only memories she seemed to have were the ones of the past several hours. She had no memories of her own, yet possessed some common knowledge, like an understanding of Equestrian language. Twilight found it difficult to even imagine having so few memories. It did, however, support her theory that this little filly had been produced by the spell cast by the cult. It would make sense for her to only have a few hours of memory, as the spell had only been cast the night before. Again, the question of whether or not the filly was really Nightmare Moon reared its ugly head, but it was a question Twilight chose to shelve in her mind for later. The filly was still crying, and it was pitting Twilight against herself. She had every desire to keep her guard up in case the filly was truly dangerous, but at the same time, she couldn't in good conscience ignore how scared the filly was. So, despite her own anxieties, Twilight crawled up onto the bed and lay down beside the young alicorn, doing her best to comfort the crying filly. It took about half an hour for the filly to finally calm down and cry herself dry. The tears seemed to have a good effect on the filly, for she looked less scared than she had been. She lay right next to Twilight, and she was working to dry her eyes as she rested her head against Twilight's shoulder.
Feeling better?
Yes?
The filly shakily answered, the first word Twilight had heard her say the entire night. The voice had a musical quality, but a fragility to it as well. It reminded Twilight of the time she had seen an earth pony playing crystal juice glasses filled with water, a glass harp. It was a feat made easier by the special horseshoes the pony had on, but it was still impressive to watch and listen to. A voice like a glass harp. Certainly not the voice Twilight would pair with an evil fallen princess bent on creating an eternal night.
That's good.
Twilight fell silent. She struggled to find something to say. When nothing came to mind, Twilight glanced at the clock and noticed the late hour.
So, it's been a long day. How about we get some sleep?
Can I sleep here?
The filly looked up at Twilight, a question that brought fresh unease to Twilight's mind. Letting the filly sleep in the same bed was asking for trouble. If she was Nightmare Moon and just playing some cruel trick, Twilight was just asking to be attacked in the middle of the night. At the same time, Twilight couldn't bring herself to refuse. It was like her mouth had forgotten how to form the word no in the face of the filly's pleading eyes.
Yes, you can, but how about I make it so we're both more comfortable?
With that, Twilight lit her horn and used her magic to shift a few blankets and pillows around. She first tucked herself beneath the covers, then she set the filly down on top of the bed's blanket and gave her a spare blanket and pillow. The blanket and pillow were meant for Spike's basket, but they were the perfect size for the filly. Soon, both Twilight and the filly were stifling yawns as the long day caught up with them. It was still relatively early, barely close to 10 o'clock, but Twilight was more than willing to call it a night. Another yawn gripped her, and her eyes were just starting to droop when she heard a small voice whisper to her.
Miss Unicorn?
Twilight was drawn back from the edge of sleep. She lifted her head and met the filly's gaze with her own.
I'm sorry. I guess I never introduced myself. My name's Twilight Sparkle.
Okay. Miss Sparkle, can I ask you something?
Yes?
The filly snuggled into Twilight's side, as if fearing she'd be pulled away.
Do you want me to leave in the morning?
What makes you think I'd want you to leave?
The filly bit her lip for a second before continuing.
You were mad at me when you first saw me. I just didn't think you'd want me around.
It's not your fault. I just thought you were some pony else for a while, but no, you don't have to leave in the morning.
Those words made the filly smile, the first honest smile she'd given all evening. Then, with that concern put to rest, the filly yawned, closed her eyes, and drifted off to sleep with Twilight following soon after.